The wind howled across the desolate platform, carrying with it the smell of wet soot and something else, something metallic and cold like old blood. It wasn't just cold, it felt like the air itself was trying to scour the warmth from your bones, a physical presence pushing against you. The train that had deposited me here, a rumbling beast of faded blue paint and rattling joints, was already pulling away, its single yellow light receding into the oppressive darkness. This forgotten station, perched precariously on the edge of nowhere, was less a place of arrival and more a gateway to absence. There were no other passengers, only shadows clinging to the corners of the crumbling concrete structure and the persistent moan of the wind. My breath plumed in thick white clouds, instantly snatched and dispersed by the biting air. I pulled my worn coat tighter, the fabric offering little resistance to the pervasive chill. This was it. The meeting point. The whispered coordinates passed through encrypted channels, the hefty sum transferred through layers of untraceable accounts. All for a glimpse, a trespass, into a place the world tried to forget. A place whispered about in hushed tones, marked on no official map as anything but a vast, empty territory. The Exclusion Zone. Or, as locals sometimes called it, the place where the world ended, quietly. A figure detached itself from the deepest patch of shadow beside a heap of rusting equipment. He didn't walk so much as flow, a dark shape against the slightly less dark night. He was short, bundled in layers of dark, nondescript clothing, a thick wool hat pulled low over his eyes. Only the lower half of his face was visible, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and vigilance. His name, according to the messages, was Boris. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze assessing, unblinking. He didn't offer a greeting. English? His voice was a low rasp, gravelly and flat. Yes. Alex. I kept my voice steady, despite the tremor in my hands that wasn't entirely due to the cold. He nodded, a single, sharp movement. The price was agreed. You understand this is outside? He tapped a finger against his temple, then pointed towards the vast, unseen darkness beyond the station lights. Very outside. I understand, I confirmed. I had done my research, read the hushed forum posts, the scattered, unverifiable accounts. The risks weren't just legal. Good. He took a step closer, and I caught a whiff of stale cigarette smoke and something sharp, like fermented cabbage. Rules. There are rules. Not for police. For the zone. For what is inside. He held up a finger. 1. You do not stray from me. Not one step. You see something, you point, you ask. You do not touch. Ever. He held up a second finger. 2. You make no loud noise. No shouting, no singing. Speak only when necessary, and speak low. The zone, it listens. He paused, and for a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something like genuine fear. 3. Inside, you never stop walking. You walk when I walk, you stand when I stand. But inside the buildings, in the open areas, you do not stand still for long. Especially in the open. This rule was delivered with particular emphasis, his voice dropping even lower. Movement is life. Stillness invites attention. He held up a fourth finger. 4. You see shapes. Hear things. Your mind plays tricks. You ignore them. You focus on the ground before you. You do not look up into the trees for too long. You do not look directly at certain things. I will tell you if I see them. Certain things? I ventured, my voice barely above a whisper now. He gave a short, dry cough that might have been a laugh. Trouble. Bad history. Things that do not like being disturbed. He lowered his hand. 5. No pictures with flash. No bright lights at night. Low light only, if needed. And no electronic noise. Phones off, everything off. The old ways are quieter. Okay, I said, absorbing the bizarre list. It wasn't the warning about radiation or patrols that sent a shiver down my spine, but these strange, almost superstitious restrictions. They felt ancient, born not of regulation but of fear. "Okay is good," he said. "You break a rule, you risk everything. For you. For me. Maybe for others. This is not a game for tourists." He gestured towards the dark expanse. "We walk from here. The vehicle is hidden further on." He turned without waiting for a response and began walking away from the station, not towards the road, but across the rough, uneven ground towards the deepest darkness. The wind seemed to redouble its efforts, pushing against me as if urging me back. The few weak lights of the station rapidly receded, leaving us in near-total blackness, guided only by the crunch of Boris's boots on frozen earth and the faint shape of his body ahead of me. The air grew colder, the smell of damp earth more potent. The land felt dead, drained of vitality. There were no sounds of distant traffic, no barking dogs, no faint hum of human habitation. Just the wind and our footsteps. We walked like this for what felt like an hour, the ground gradually sloping downwards. The uneven terrain demanded my full attention, but my mind raced, trying to process the rules, the oppressive atmosphere, the sheer wrongness of this place even before we'd properly entered it. Soon, the ground leveled out slightly, and I could discern the faintest outline of trees ahead, a ragged, impenetrable wall against the sky. This had to be the edge of the zone. Boris stopped abruptly, and I halted behind him, remembering rule number 3 wasn't in effect yet. He turned, his face a pale blur in the gloom. "From here," he murmured, gesturing towards the tree line. "The air changes. The rules apply. You feel it?" I strained my senses. The cold was deeper, yes, but there was something else. A stillness within the wind, a heavy, watchful silence that pressed in on my ears. It wasn't just quiet, it was the absence of sound, a void. And the smell, it wasn't just damp earth now. It was something else, something metallic, damp, and faintly sweet, like decaying flowers mixed with rust. It made the hair on my arms stand up. "Yes," I whispered back, my voice thin and reedy in the vast silence. "I feel it." Boris gave a curt nod. "Good. Not everyone does. Some people, they walk in blind. They do not last long." He turned again, taking a deep breath of the chilling air. "Remember the rules, Alex. Especially Rule 3. He stepped forward, melting into the darker shadows beneath the trees, and I followed, the oppressive silence swallowing me whole as I crossed the invisible threshold into the forbidden land. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the worn plastic. She blinked, then blinked again, staring into the deepening gloom where the forest began. Nothing. Just the impenetrable wall of ancient trees, black against the bruised purple sky. Had she imagined it? A trick of the fading light, exhaustion from the long drive, the unsettling quiet of this place. She took a shaky breath, telling herself it was nothing, just her mind playing tricks in an unfamiliar environment. Reassured, or trying to be, she nudged the gas pedal, and the rental car crunched slowly over the loose gravel track towards the cluster of houses that made up the village of Oakhaven, or Stegerului as the sign had read back on the main road. The sign itself had been unsettling, weathered wood carved with symbols she didn't recognize, vaguely geometric and unsettlingly sharp. As she drove among the buildings, the quiet pressed in, heavy and complete. No barking dogs, no children playing, no distant murmur of conversation or radio. It was unnaturally still. The houses were old, built of heavy timber and stone, with steeply pitched roofs like hunched shoulders. Many windows were dark, either shuttered or seemingly vacant. Intricate carvings adorned doorframes and window sills, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe in her peripheral vision. Some houses had symbols etched or painted near the entrances, the same angular, unsettling marks from the village sign, or crude shapes that looked vaguely like eyes or distorted figures. Protective wards, perhaps? Against what? She finally reached the small square, marked by a stone well and a single, massive oak tree, its branches thick and twisted like arthritic fingers against the sky. On one side stood a slightly larger building with a sagging sign, Hanul Serbului Dormit. The Sleeping Stag Inn. Her destination. Parking the car, she hesitated for a moment, watching the twilight deepen. The forest she'd seen the shadow in felt closer now, looming over the village, a dark, watchful presence. She shook her head, trying to clear the growing sense of dread, and got out of the car. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and something else she couldn't place, metallic, perhaps, or simply stale and ancient. The inn door creaked open heavily as she pushed it. Inside, it was dim and smelled strongly of wood smoke, stale beer, and something else, faintly sweet and cloying. The interior was all dark wood, heavy beams, a worn plank floor, massive furniture carved with the same unsettling patterns seen outside. A single lamp, oil or kerosene perhaps, flickered on a counter in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows. Behind the counter stood a man. He was tall, gaunt, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that seemed too dark and deep, pools of shadow in the flickering light. He wore simple, dark clothing that looked homespun. He didn't smile. Didn't speak immediately. He just watched her approach, his gaze unnervingly steady. "Bună seara," Sarah said, attempting the little Romanian she knew, adding in English, "I have a reservation." "Sarah Miller?" The man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached under the counter and produced a heavy ledger, bound in what looked like rough hide. He flipped through the pages, his fingers thick and calloused. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. The only sound was the crackle of the lamp and the distant, unseen wind sighing through the eaves. Finally, he stopped at a page and pointed a thick finger at a line. Her name was scrawled there in dark ink. He grunted, then reached for a large, iron key hanging on a hook on the wall. He didn't state the room number. He just picked up the lamp and gestured with his head towards a darkened hallway beyond the counter. "Follow," he said, his voice a low rumble, heavily accented. It was the first word he'd spoken. Sarah felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. The man's silence, his intense stare, the lack of any welcoming words, it was beyond simple shyness or cultural differences. There was an unnerving stillness about him, a detachment that felt wrong. She followed him down the hallway. The floorboards creaked loudly under their weight. The air grew colder. The walls were bare stone in places, rough and damp, with wooden planks higher up. More of the strange carvings were etched into the door frames. He stopped at the third door on the left. The key was massive, ornate, and looked older than the inn itself. He unlocked the heavy wooden door with a grating sound. He pushed the door open, holding the lamp high. The room was small, sparse. A narrow bed covered with a thick, hand-stitched quilt, a wooden chest of drawers, a simple chair. The air was cold and held that same unidentifiable, cloying smell from downstairs, stronger here. There was a single window, small and high up on the wall, covered with heavy, dark fabric. The innkeeper set the lamp on the chest of drawers. The light was barely enough to illuminate the room, pushing the corners back into impenetrable shadow. He turned and looked at her again, his gaze lingering on her face for a moment that felt far too long. "Night," he said, his voice flat. He left the lamp and the key on the chest and walked back out, leaving the door slightly ajar. The moment he was gone, the heavy silence of the inn rushed back in, punctuated only by the faint, irregular creaking of the old building. Sarah didn't close the door immediately. She stood there, listening, her heart pounding against her ribs. She felt utterly isolated, miles from anywhere familiar, in a place that felt ancient and watchful. Closing the door finally, the heavy wood shutting out the faint light from the hall, plunged the room into near darkness save for the flickering lamp. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to writhe. The air felt colder, heavier. She crossed to the window and carefully lifted the heavy fabric covering it. It looked out towards the back of the inn. Beyond a small, overgrown yard, the forest began abruptly. Not a gentle transition, but a sudden, dense wall of trees. They stood like silent sentinels, their branches tangled and black against the sliver of moon that had risen. And there, right at the edge of the trees, where the shadow had been before, she saw it again. Not a shadow this time, but a faint, intermittent glint, like something reflecting the tiny amount of moonlight. It wasn't moving. It was just there. Watching. A shiver ran down her spine, deeper than the cold. She quickly dropped the fabric back over the window, her hands trembling. The room felt smaller now, more confined. The cloying smell seemed stronger. She hugged herself, trying to ward off the cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The silence outside the inn was absolute, but inside, she thought she heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching sound, coming from the wall beside the bed. Like claws on old wood. Sarah froze, every muscle tensed, her breath catching in her throat. The faint light filtering through the gaps in the old wooden shutters outside the minka barely pierced the gloom of the long, narrow corridor. Dust motes danced sluggishly in the weak beams, disturbed only by her own stillness. The sound. It wasn't leaves, she was inside, deep within this derelict house the villagers whispered about. It was a dry, scraping rustle, like something light being dragged over tatami mats. But there were no tatami mats in this section of the house, only the dark, worn wooden floorboards beneath her feet. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing in on her ears, making the blood pound in her temples. She strained to listen, her eyes wide, scanning the shadows that clung to the corners and ceiling like cobwebs made of darkness. Had she imagined it? The old house groaned occasionally, settling on its ancient foundations. The wind outside sometimes whistled through gaps in the walls, but this was different. It was specific, localized, and undeniably came from that room at the corridor's end, a room whose sliding shoji screen doors were firmly closed. The doors looked older, more fragile than the rest, their paper panels faded and brittle, one even had a dark, ominous stain near the bottom. A tremor ran through her. The warnings from old Tanaka-san, the village elder with eyes like chips of dark stone, echoed in her mind. That place, he had said, his voice low and rough, gesturing vaguely towards the hill where this abandoned farmstead sat, has a sickness. A long memory. Stay away. She had dismissed it as quaint superstition, the kind of folklore charmingly preserved in remote Japanese villages. Now, standing in the cold heart of the place, the charm had utterly evaporated, replaced by a creeping dread that felt ancient and sharp. Rationalization warred with primal fear. A rat? Unlikely to make that specific sound, and it had felt deliberate, almost rhythmic. The wind? No opening here for wind to drag anything. A person? Who would be in this abandoned, cursed house? The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Was she not alone? The hairs on her arms stood on end, despite the chill that had settled in the corridor. She took a tiny, hesitant step back, the old floorboard groaning loudly under her boot. The sound seemed to echo, amplified in the sudden quiet. She froze again, listening. Nothing. Only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. Then, it came again. Louder this time, and closer to the shoji screen. A distinct dragging sound, followed by that dry rustle. Scrappy. Rustle rustle. It was slow, deliberate, and seemed to be moving towards the door. It wasn't small. Whatever was making that sound was inside that room, and it was approaching the only barrier between them. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, scramble back through the main part of the house, out the broken door, and down the hill as fast as her legs would carry her. But a terrible, morbid curiosity held her rooted to the spot. Or maybe it was fear itself, paralyzing her. She couldn't run past the source of the sound without knowing what it was. Or maybe she just couldn't move at all. Slowly, painstakingly, she forced herself to take a step forward, then another, towards the closed shoji screen. The dust puffed up around her feet with each movement. The air grew noticeably colder as she approached the far end of the corridor. It wasn't just the chill of an old, unheated house, it was a penetrating cold that felt unnatural, draining the warmth from her bones. A faint, unpleasant smell reached her nostrils, not just dust and decay, but something else, cloying and vaguely metallic, like old, dry blood or stagnant water left to fester. She reached the end of the corridor, standing perhaps a meter from the shoji screen. The paper was discolored, a dirty yellow-brown with that large, dark stain near the floor, shaped like a spreading fan. Her hand trembled as she cautiously reached out towards the screen, intending to try and peer through a small tear she could see near the edge. Just as her fingers brushed against the brittle paper, the scraping sound stopped directly on the other side of the screen. Absolute silence descended once more, so profound it felt deafening. She held her breath, listening intently. Nothing. And then, without a sound, the paper panel of the shoji screen rippled inward slightly, as if something had gently pressed against it from the other side. It wasn't much, just a subtle bulge in the fragile paper, but it was enough. Enough to show that something was right there. Waiting. And it knew she was here. Her heart leaped into her throat. She recoiled instantly, stumbling back a step. As her eyes darted across the screen, searching for any sign, any shape behind the paper, a shadow detached itself from the deep darkness within the room, flowing across the lower half of the screen. It was a shape, indistinct and wavering, darker than the surrounding gloom, moving slowly from one side to the other, just behind the paper. It seemed low to the ground, and its movement wasn't quite right, not like an animal, not like a person walking. It was a glide, a scrape, a ripple of unnatural darkness against the fragile paper. Then, just as the shadow reached the edge of the screen nearest to her, it paused. And a sliver of darkness, deeper than any shadow, appeared in a tiny tear in the paper, like a single, lidless eye watching her from the void within the room. The sound was unlike anything Anya had ever heard. It was a high keen, thin and sharp like glass shattering, but drawn out into a long, pulsating wave that seemed to claw at the silence of the night. It wasn't the cry of an animal, not a bird or a wildcat. It was too rhythmic, too purposeful. It vibrated in the very air, seeming to seep through the thin paper shoji screens of her room in the old wooden house. She sat upright on the futon, heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, the moon was a pale sliver in the inky sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the small, meticulously raked gravel garden visible through the screen. The village, nestled deep in the valley, had been utterly silent minutes before. No distant traffic, no late-night sounds of habitation, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant murmur of the river. Now, only that sound. It rose and fell, a chilling lament that felt ancient and deeply wrong. It didn't sound human, yet it held a quality of profound suffering or perhaps an unfathomable rage. It seemed to come from the heart of the village, perhaps near the old shrine she had seen on her walk earlier, the one overshadowed by the enormous, gnarled cypress tree at the edge of the woods. Anya slid her legs out from under the covers, her bare feet touching the cool tatami mat. The floorboards creaked faintly as she stood. The traditional room, with its sparse furnishings, a low table, a single scroll on the wall, a stack of extra blankets in the corner, felt both comforting in its simplicity and alien in its unfamiliarity. Every shadow felt deeper, every corner seemed to hold its breath. She crept towards the shoji screen facing the garden. Hesitating for a moment, she reached out a trembling hand and gently slid one panel open just a crack. The cool night air, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, flowed into the room. The sound was louder here, more immediate. It still seemed centered on the other side of the house, towards the village path. Through the gap in the screen, she could see the dark shapes of roofs belonging to neighboring houses, their eaves curving against the moonlight. The forest beyond the village was a solid black wall, impenetrable and silent save for the whale. No lights were on in any of the houses. The village was not just quiet, it felt deserted, as if every inhabitant had vanished or, worse, was deliberately hiding. Was this a local custom? A strange nocturnal ritual? It sounded too pained, too unnatural for that. It set her teeth on edge and sent shivers down her spine. Rational thought warred with primal fear. She should close the screen, lock the door, bury herself under the futon and pretend she hadn't heard it. But the sound was a hook in her mind, dragging her towards its source with a terrifying magnetism. She had to know. Swallowing hard, she pulled on a sweater and a pair of jeans, her movements clumsy in the dark. She slipped her feet into her sneakers. Moving as quietly as possible, she opened the door to her room and stepped out into the dark hallway. The old wood groaned under her weight despite her care. Shadows danced in the corners, thrown by the faint moonlight filtering through a window at the end of the corridor. She navigated the unfamiliar layout, her hand trailing against the cool wooden wall. The air grew colder as she descended the narrow staircase, each step a potential betrayer with its loud creak. Downstairs, the common area was an expanse of silent darkness. The heavy, dark wood furniture loomed like sleeping beasts. She reached the entranceway, where Geta and other shoes were neatly lined up on the step down into the stone-floored gencan. Her own shoes felt heavy and foreign next to the traditional footwear. She pushed the heavy wooden door outwards a fraction of an inch. The wail intensified, raw and piercing, seemingly just down the path. The air outside was sharp, carrying the same earthy, pine scent, but also something else now, something faintly metallic and sweet, like old blood and decaying flowers. Stepping outside onto the gravel path, she pulled the door shut behind her, leaving only a sliver of light visible under it. The moon was brighter here, illuminating the empty path and the dark shapes of the houses flanking it. The silence of the village was absolute, broken only by that horrifying sound coming from the direction of the large cypress tree. Moving slowly, keeping to the deeper shadows cast by the eaves of the houses, Anya began to walk towards the sound. Her heart pounded in her ears, a frantic counterpoint to the unnerving wail. Every pebble crunching under her shoes sounded like a thunderclap. She strained her eyes, peering ahead into the gloom. As she neared the end of the path, where the land sloped slightly towards the forest and the shrine stood under the ancient tree, other sounds began to emerge from beneath the dominant wail. A low murmur, like chanting, barely audible. A faint shuffling, rhythmic and heavy. And a smell, stronger now, thick and cloying. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable sense of dread. She could see the dark shape of the torii gate ahead, two uprights and a crossbar stark against the night sky. Beside it, the immense, sprawling form of the cypress tree loomed, its branches like skeletal arms against the moon. And beneath the tree, near the small, dark shape of the shrine building, there were figures. Dark shapes, perhaps half a dozen, clustered together. They moved with a strange, slow purpose, silhouetted against the faint moonlight reflecting off something on the ground. The wail seemed to emanate from the very center of their gathering, rising and falling as they moved. The low chanting grew clearer, a repetitive, guttural drone in a language she didn't recognize. Driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate need to understand, Anya edged closer, hiding behind a large, moss-covered stone lantern by the path. She strained her eyes, trying to make out what they were doing, what was making that sound. They were gathered around the base of the ancient cypress tree. Their movements were deliberate, ritualistic. She could see glimpses of white cloth, dark hair. They weren't facing her, their backs hunched over something on the ground. The wail reached a sudden, piercing crescendo, sharper than before, and one of the figures straightened up, turning slightly. In the pale moonlight, Anya saw the glint of something wet on their hands. And then she saw the source of the wail, or rather, what was being done to cause it. They were gathered around a newly dug pit at the base of the tree. And from the pit, held aloft by two of the figures while others worked below, was something writhing, something pale and glistening in the moonlight, something that twisted and shrieked with that unearthly, keening sound. It looked like a root, pulled partially from the earth, but it moved like flesh, and its cry tore at the fabric of the night. As the figure turned more fully, catching the moonlight, Anya saw not a human face, but a smooth, featureless expanse where a face should be, slick with the same dark, viscous liquid that coated their hands. The silence that followed was deeper, heavier than the darkness outside. It pressed in on them from all sides, thick and suffocating. Ben shifted on the worn mattress, the springs groaning in protest. Anya could feel his tension across the narrow space between their beds. The rhythmic, low chanting from the woods had simply stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. No fading, no final note, just an abrupt, unnerving silence that now pulsed with the frantic beat of their own hearts. What was that? Ben whispered, his voice tight. Anya didn't have an answer. She had spent years studying remote cultures, their rituals, their folklore. This sounded like nothing she'd ever read about. It was primal, guttural, a sound that felt older than the gnarled fir trees clinging to the mountain slopes outside. She slipped from the bed, the rough wool blanket scratching against her skin. She padded softly to the single window, the glass ancient and wavy, distorting the view of the moonless night. Outside, nothing. The dense forest surrounding the small cluster of houses that made up Krivopol was a wall of impenetrable blackness. The air, even inside the room, felt thin and cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Below, she could just make out the silhouette of the guesthouse's steep, snow-reinforced roof, a characteristic feature of these mountain dwellings designed to withstand the crushing weight of winter. The wood of the house itself felt ancient and alive around them, groaning and settling with 1,000 tiny noises that, tonight, sounded sinister. They were in the attic room, tucked under the eaves. It was meant to be charmingly rustic, with its exposed beams and rough-hewn furniture. Now, it felt like a cage. Krivopol was nestled deep in a valley, reached only by a single, winding track that was little more than a muddy rut this time of year. Leaving wasn't an option, especially not in the dead of night, unsure of what, or who, had been making those sounds. It didn't sound like people, Ben said, voicing the fear Anya felt but hadn't articulated. Not really. It was too uniform. And low. Like it was coming from the ground. Anya hugged herself, trying to ward off the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She thought of their host, Baba Ilina. Her face, usually lined with a kind of weathered kindness, had turned stony whenever they asked about the woods at night. She had simply shrugged and muttered something in their fragmented communication about sleeping things and not waking them. At the time, Anya had filed it away as typical mountain folklore, a way to keep outsiders from wandering into dangerous terrain. Now, it felt like a warning. A very real, very immediate warning. A new sound reached them, faint at first. A smell too. The earthy scent intensified, joined by something else, something vaguely organic, like wet fur and stagnant water. It seemed to seep in through the walls themselves. The sound followed, a soft, irregular scratching. Ben froze. Anya strained her ears. It wasn't coming from outside the window, but from the wall directly opposite it, the one that faced the dense tree line just beyond the small, untended garden. Scratch, drag, scratch. It was too high up to be a mouse, too deliberate to be just the old house settling. What is that? Ben whispered again, his voice barely audible. The scratching paused, then resumed, louder this time, more insistent. It sounded like fingernails scraping against the rough-cut timber planks of the wall, or perhaps something made of bone. It moved slowly, horizontally along the wall, perhaps a meter or so from the floor. It wasn't fast or frantic, but slow, methodical, almost exploratory. Anya found herself holding her breath. Every nerve ending screamed at her. This wasn't folklore. This wasn't the wind. This was something real, something outside their understanding, and it was right there, on the other side of a thin wooden wall. The scraping stopped again, right where it had been. A moment of silence, so taut it felt like it would snap. Then, a soft thud against the wood, just once, followed by the distinct, sickening sound of something wet and heavy pressing against the timber. It stayed there for a long moment, a presence felt rather than seen, just inches away from where they stood huddled in the dark. The air in the room grew colder still, thick with the smell of damp earth and that other, unidentifiable stench. It felt like the mountain itself was exhaling, a foul, ancient breath against their fragile shelter. They stood petrified, listening to the silence and the frantic pounding of their own blood in their ears, acutely aware of the thin barrier between them and whatever waited outside in the suffocating darkness of Krivo Pole. The stale air hit them first, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly sweet and cloying like decaying flowers but with an unsettling, metallic undertone they couldn't place. The beam from Alex's small torch cut through the absolute blackness below, revealing rough-hewn steps descending into a cramped cellar. It wasn't deep, maybe 10 feet down, but the oppressive atmosphere seemed to magnify the distance. Sarah clutched his arm, her fingers digging into his bicep through his thin shirt. Her breath hitched, a small, sharp sound in the suffocating quiet. Below them, arranged in a rough circle around a shallow, dark pit in the center of the dirt floor, were the figures. Not large, none more than 2 feet tall, carved from dark wood. They weren't crudely made, there was a disturbing artistry to them. Each figure was different, some kneeling, some standing, their limbs contorted into unnatural poses. Wide, round eyes were painted onto their featureless faces in stark white, fixed upwards towards the sliver of light from the trapdoor. Their mouths were simple slits, or sometimes open O shapes, but somehow conveyed silent screams. Around the base of several figures lay small, withered bundles wrapped in faded, discolored cloth, and tiny piles of what looked like dried fruit and grain. It was undeniably an altar, a place of worship, or perhaps something far darker. A profound chill, colder than the damp air should warrant, settled over them. It wasn't just the sight, it was the palpable wrongness of the place, the feeling that they had stumbled upon something ancient and actively malevolent. The silence pressing in was absolute, save for the frantic thumping of their own hearts in their ears. Alex slowly moved the beam, sweeping it across the figures. There were perhaps a dozen of them. As the light lingered on one figure near the edge of the pit, a flash of pale color caught his eye. It was tied to the figure's twisted arm, a thin strip of fabric, the color of old bone, that looked suspiciously like a finger bone. Sarah made a small, choked sound beside him. "Alex, what is this place?" Her voice was barely a whisper, thin with fear. He didn't have an answer. His mind scrambled, trying to process what they were seeing through the lens of the cautious tales the villagers had sometimes shared, the hushed mentions of spirits bound to the earth, of offerings made to keep the quiet place from stirring. Was this where those appeasements were made? But the figures felt captive, not appeased. Their painted eyes seemed to stare not in reverence, but in perpetual terror. The air grew heavier, pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. Dust motes danced in the light beam, but they seemed to move with an unnatural slowness. A soft, scraping sound reached them from the bottom of the pit in the center of the circle. It was faint, like something being dragged slowly across rough earth. Alex froze, his hand shaking slightly, causing the light beam to jitter. He focused the torch downwards. The pit was dark, too dark for the small torch to penetrate fully. But the scraping came again, a deliberate, rhythmic pull. Scrape, drag. Scrape, drag. Panic, cold and corrosive, began to spread through Alex's veins. This wasn't just an old ritual site. There was something there. Below. Or maybe trapped within the figures themselves. The wide, painted eyes felt like they were watching them now, not just the empty air above. The oppressive silence outside the cellar seemed to hum, a low-frequency vibration that resonated deep in their bones. The feeling of being watched intensified tenfold. They were exposed, framed in the opening above this horrific tableau. A floorboard groaned directly above them, back near the entrance of the dilapidated shrine they had entered. Not the trapdoor they were standing on, but a sound from the building they thought was empty. They had been so focused on the cellar, they hadn't heard anyone enter the structure above. Or perhaps, whatever made the sound had been there all along, waiting. Alex reacted instinctively. He yanked Sarah back from the edge of the opening, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Run," he hissed, the word barely audible. They scrambled back from the trapdoor, tripping over loose floorboards in their haste. The musty air of the shrine above the cellar felt suddenly fresh compared to the stagnant horror they had peered into. The scraping sound from below seemed to quicken, becoming more frantic. They didn't look back. Bursting through the rickety wooden door, they stumbled out into the humid night. The sounds of the jungle were muted, the usual symphony of insects and unseen creatures replaced by an unnatural quiet that felt like the land itself was holding its breath. They didn't speak, didn't dare make a sound louder than their own ragged breathing as they half ran, half walked back towards the cluster of lights that marked the main part of the village. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of terror through them. The darkness pressed in from all sides, no longer just empty space but potentially hiding eyes, shapes, things that shouldn't exist. Reaching their small rented bungalow felt like reaching a fortress, a fragile barrier against the encroaching dread. They slammed the door shut, fumbling with the lock, bolting it multiple times even though they knew how flimsy it was. Leaning against the door, they finally allowed themselves to tremble. The image of the painted eyes, the contorted figures, the dark pit, and the terrible scraping sound were seared into their minds. The faint, sweet and sickly smell seemed to cling to their clothes, to their skin. The usual sounds of the village outside, distant voices, a radio playing softly, the occasional bark of a dog, were absent. There was only the quiet night, and beneath it, a low, almost imperceptible hum that resonated with the vibration they had felt near the cellar. They hadn't just seen something forbidden. They had disturbed it. And the quiet place, the villagers, protector, or whatever entity was bound to those terrifying figures in the earth, knew they were here. Then, from the direction of the path leading back towards the old shrine, a single sound cut through the oppressive silence. It was a low, guttural chant, repeated over and over, mournful and utterly devoid of human warmth. It was drawing closer.